what's really required is that we have to reinvent the way that the world works.
Thanks for joining us. It's Ronit and Gaurav again on What's Next. Gaurav, you're zooming in from somewhere exotic.
Lisbon, very European exotic.
Lisbon, Portugal. Lisbon,
That's right.
Portugal. It is European, but it's one of the, I find, most extra European of the cities I've been to. It feels like you're on the crossroads of, you're definitely in Europe, 100%, but you're somehow in the crossroads of Europe, Africa, and Latin America, the Americas. It just feels there's something special as you walk around Lisbon. It just feels like you could be in Brazil, you could be in North Africa, you're definitely still in Europe, and I hope you're picking out on tarts and stuff like that.
Oh, I'm not sparing any coffee shop that has a fresh bakery on it.
Excellent, excellent. You missed an opportunity to make an inappropriate joke there, but let's get our guest today, Karl, involved. Karl, you and Gaurav know each other, I believe.
No, it's just a vicious rumor.
There are lots of vicious rumors like that. Anyways, this is the vicious rumor I've been told by Mr. Dhar himself, that you apparently know each other. So introduce yourself to our audience and maybe also give us a little bit of context of why you got the misfortune of knowing Gaurav Dhar.
My name's Karl Feilder. I moved to Dubai 14 years ago to set up and run the first biofuels business in the Middle East. And most people thought I was completely crazy, but it turns out I'm not crazy. And now that we're hosting COP28, which I have to tell you 14 years ago could not have been further from everybody's imagination, but we're hosting COP28. The whole world has decided they can now spell sustainability, although they don't quite know what it means. And they're all on my doorstep. And it's wonderful. And this just happens to be Gaurav's hometown. He grew up here. And we ran into each other years ago when we both had this great idea. Wouldn't it be nice to try and improve the quality of MBA graduates by telling them some stuff that nobody else is going to tell them about how to start and run your own business and how to grow that business and scale it?
Awesome. Let's unpack some of those really relevant points. I'm going to start with a really dumb question. Dumb for me, because biofuels. What is a biofuel?
So biofuel is a fuel that can run in a normal internal combustion engine, but where the source of that is not crude oil. It is what I would describe as freshly deceased animals and plants. So if you think about fossil fuel is essentially 300 million year old animals and plants. We make a fuel out of freshly deceased ones, and normally we're using used cooking oil or rendered animal fats, anything that is essentially a waste stream. And it's of biogenic source. That's the official definition. So we're using a biogenic source, using heat, chemistry, and a bit of pressure to create a fuel that looks, smells, and breathes just like a normal fossil fuel, except that it's got a massively lower carbon footprint.
And that last bit is obviously the key. If it's recently deceased rather than a zillion years ago, you're saying the carbon footprint's a lot less. Can you unpack that a bit more for our audience, please?
Well, essentially, because it's recently deceased, certainly for the plant matter, it's also recently been photosynthesizing. So essentially what we're doing is taking a biogenic source that has already compensated for its own carbon footprint, and we're converting that into something that replaces a fossil fuel that has a large carbon footprint. There's cleverer people than me that do the calculations for us once a year. It's run by the European Union, and they calculate that our fuel is 86% lower carbon footprint than a regular fuel. And that is what we all need to be doing, is running our vehicles on lower carbon footprint fuels.
So your company produces this or distributes the biofuels?
We make it.
Production chain?
We make it. So we take in the waste raw materials. We've got 2 factories, and we clean up the oil by filtering it and getting rid of anything that shouldn't be there. And then we chemically react it under pressure to form these new fuels. And then we sell them to lots and lots of customers. And in the Middle East, we're selling them to a few you might have heard of, Emirates Airline, Etihad, McDonald's, Nestle, lots and lots of big brand names, and all basically the large companies that know that they need to do something about their carbon footprint, but have a really big struggle making a big impact on their carbon footprint because we live in the middle of the desert and most of their footprint is essentially air conditioning.
You said that when you moved here 14 years ago to Dubai, people thought you were somewhere on the insanity spectrum, and it wasn't the obvious thing to do. When did you begin to notice a change, whether it was talk and then walk in terms of interest and then tangible sort of change on this topic? Is that relatively recently? Was it actually further back than we can imagine? When sort of, if you draw us a kind of graph or a curve, no interest to a lot of interest.
I mean, there wasn't very much interest 14 years ago, that's for sure. Although I moved from running DHL's global carbon reduction program, I moved from Germany to the Middle East, and we were already well into reducing the carbon footprint at DHL. So it had been well understood elsewhere. But over the last probably 5 or 6 years, I think the first signs that something serious was happening was when we managed to persuade the Expo 2020 committee that the site for Expo 2020 should be constructed using a biofuel blend. So we were involved in building Expo 2020 and providing the fuel for all the earth movers and the site offices and the electricity supply until they had a grid connection. And that was the first real government mandate that we saw. And since then, about 4.5 years ago, we started to supply ADNOC, which is the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company. And they're now using our fuel internally to move their ships. So they use it on their marine vessels. And they've also been using it to move their trucks around. So when they fill up a filling station with diesel and petrol, the trucks that deliver that fuel are actually running on our biodiesel. And that to me seems a little bit ironic, but it works. And I'm very happy to have them as a customer.
You mentioned Expo, and obviously we've got this major event coming up this year with COP28. What for the cynics out there who are like, this is just kind of hand waving PR. What are the tangible benefits of having COP28 here in the UAE, in the Middle East again? What comes out of it? What would you like to see come out of it?
Well, I actually think it's a change. There's a big risky move that's going on for sure. Hosting COP28 in the UAE and specifically in Dubai with the head of ADNOC as the president-elect of COP28, that's quite a bold move. But if you think that we've now had 27 conferences of the parties, 27 COPs, and at each one, they have decided that we need to reduce greenhouse gases. And at each one, they've reported that greenhouse gases have gone up. I would certainly, for one, vote for a change, because if you do something wrong 27 times, it doesn't mean that the 28th time it's going to go right unless you do change something. And the argument that's being presented, certainly in the UAE internationally, is, guys, you've essentially locked the oil and gas industry out of this process for 25 or 26 meetings. We think it's about time you let us show you that we can do some good. And the cynics, of course, would say, come on, they're the enemy. The oil and gas industry is the reason we have this huge problem. The oil and gas industry would say, actually, it's not the oil and gas industry that caused the problem. It's the fact that everybody wanted cheap fuel and that everybody has driven the world's economy based on the fact that diesel and petrol and aviation fuel have been available at relatively cheap prices. If we hadn't seen 150 years ago the discovery of cheap oil, we might be in a very different situation. But the thing is, we found cheap oil. We decided as a species that we were going to exploit it. And as I keep pointing out to people, here we are 150 years later, and we've used at least half of the 300 million years worth of supply of fossil fuel. And we've used that in 150 years. So we've used a lot of fossil fuel and we burnt it and created a greenhouse gas problem for ourselves. And I'm very sad to continually report that as a species, we seem to not understand that that's a bad thing. I just wake up every morning and wonder how I'm going to get through the day of meeting yet another person who doesn't realize how serious this is. My best analogy is to people, you know, it's Dubai. Everybody loves their cars here. We've got petrol heads. I've done motoring programs with people who say, yeah, Karl, the Tesla's lovely, but really what you need is a big V8. That's what gets my rocks off. And I say to them, okay, take your big V8, lock it in your garage and turn the engine on, because that is equivalent of what we're doing with our climate. We are just poisoning ourselves. If I put the engine on in my Tesla in my garage, I'll still be sitting there 3 days later, listening to music, watching Netflix on the beautiful screen and having a real ball because I've got permanent internet connection. The guy in the V8 will be dead. He'll have asphyxiated. And that's what we're doing to our planet. We're asphyxiating it.
Well, we can delve more into this topic, but I want to bring Gaurav into the conversation because...
No, he's having a nice time in Portugal. Leave him alone.
Gaurav and his, bakeries and tarts, right? I mean...
No comment, but comment.
Let's go back to... Let's go back to discussing building businesses, because obviously you've built a business in this area, and that's how you and Gaurav met at a business school, or that's where you became friends. Gaurav, come into the conversation and explain to the audience a little bit about like how you and Karl know each other and what you were telling these impressionable students, MBA or otherwise.
Thanks, Ronit. I think when Karl and I met at the program, we actually didn't work together. We worked adjacent to each other. So the commonality of the conversation really came together about a value set of giving people genuine business blocks on what they need to do to make profitable businesses rather than just businesses that are attractive on paper or perhaps to potential investors. And during those conversations of how people perceive building businesses or what they need to do as essentials to building those businesses is where Karl and I really, really connected. And we said the message that needs to go out to people in these rooms at such a fundamental stage of their careers or even some of their pre-careers is essential for us to make sure that they're built fundamentally correct, not only for them, but for future generations going forward. Because the messages that were out there generally about how glamorous starting a business was or how wonderful it was to be in a spotlight for a moment at a conference really diluted the importance of the time and effort and commitment someone needs on the journey before they become an entrepreneur. And you know, I've been in a family business where I took over a family business and I faced my own challenges and I faced my own learnings along the way. And Karl has built businesses as well. I mean, Karl, correct me if I'm wrong, one IPO and one acquisition, was it correct? Microsoft acquired your first company or you IPO'd your first company?
6 trade sales, 2 IPOs, and I'm still working on my 3rd IPO at the moment.
There you go. And so when Karl told me about what he was building and how he was building it, I became even more intrigued because it was a subject I was 100% alien to. 100% alien to. I had no clue about it. Karl really educated me from start to finish about it. I learned as much as I could in my capacity for time. I still have a lot of learning to do, but it was fascinating, you know, meeting somebody who thought differently, but thought like a very fundamental entrepreneur at the same time. It's a very challenging engagement that he took on. And that was, for me, very, very exciting and a learning experience as well. And you see where we met, I think, Karl, 6 years ago.
Sounds
6
right,
years
yeah.
ago, I think. And where he is today with what he was doing with neutral fuels and where it's going, it's fantastic. And now we're at COP28. I can't believe it. I can't believe that we're doing COP28, and I think it's a fantastic opportunity for discussions to take place. But
Ronit, the key thing to realize is that Gaurav and I know each other from a business school, sure, but we were both there in order to impart wisdom and share our knowledge and our understanding of business with the students. We weren't there as students having a laugh and just trying to put a few PowerPoint slides together. We were actually trying to convey some understanding of what the real world's like. And I say, and I know he does as well, when we're in front of the students, we say to them, this is a safe place to fail. If you can't fail here, then you're never going to work in the real world. And these students are paying a lot of money to be there, and they're there, and sometimes they just don't show up with their A game. And we have to tell them, that's not good enough. Go back and redo this again, work harder. I did have one young lady on the last session that I did who basically walked in and said, my dad's a billionaire. And I said, well, that's interesting. She said, yeah, but I don't need to do this presentation because my dad's rich. And I thought, how did you get onto this program if that's the situation? Because indeed, I've never met anybody that is truly wealthy that would expect their child to behave like that. They would expect them to go out and work hard. Anyway.
She actually just said, look, this exercise or whatever I've been said, not doing it because my daddy is a billionaire.
Yeah.
What was she doing on the MBA class? I mean...
I'm not sure. Shopping, maybe. Having a nice time in Dubai. It's just, a bit strange, but at least I can't name names. I hope
no.
Doesn't have a pet assassin up his sleeve or anything.
Don't do it, Karl. Don't do it. We like you too much.
So anyway, coming back to the whole thing, what's really required is that we have to reinvent the way that the world works. And that requires some new ways of doing things. One of the things I ask the students when I'm talking to them about sustainability is, do you know when we had the first net zero city? And they all scratch their heads and they go, well, we haven't got any yet. And I say to them, well, it was actually in 1895 when they powered the city of Niagara from a hydroelectric power generator, and they put lights in the city, and it was running at zero carbon footprint.
Oh, wow.
And then since then we discovered cheap oil, and then we put carbon dioxide into the atmosphere at a crazy rate. And that's what's changed everything. But if we went back to that situation in 1895 and we didn't discover cheap oil, we would be doing everything totally differently.
And Karl, just talking about the number of businesses, the UAE is extremely good at communicating opportunities. And as a result of COP28, I imagine there are a number of international companies and entrepreneurs alike in the space that are looking to come to the region because they believe that there's a conversation that can be had and these opportunities to explore from a business point of view or an investment point of view. While that's happening, I want to talk about that a little bit, about what you're saying. But before we get to that, how many sustainable companies are homegrown in the region that you're aware of?
There's actually surprisingly few. There are some. I could probably think of maybe a dozen or so. And some of them have done quite well. A couple of them have grown up to, half a unicorn, or even they've got a path to being $1 billion.
I think Yellow Door is one of them, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And I met with the founder of Yellow Door fairly recently and had really good chats with him. And their approach was definitely very much more financial and calculating than the sort of passion-driven entrepreneurs that you tend to see at the hobbyist end of the scale. And that's good. I mean, you've got to have some people that really are focused on how to make this a scalable proposition. And there are plenty of opportunities out there. But to come back to your point about the UAE and attracting ideas and reflecting the fact that there's lots of opportunities, you and I are actually a very good example of this. I came here because I saw that there was an opportunity and I thought I could make a difference. You were already here. And I guess my question is, how many of the people that have grown up and been based here are founding these startups? And how many are founded by people moving into the region, coming from abroad? Because certainly my local friends here don't like risk. And they're very, very unhappy with the idea of taking a business risk. So I think that we need more people to move to the region who have this entrepreneurial mindset to get things going.
And I think the infrastructure, the accessibility, the stage to set the private sector, the public sector, and the decision makers to come together, I think COP28 should hopefully be a very strong catalyst for that to happen. And You're involved with that program, aren't you, to some degree?
Yeah, I am. But in many ways, COP28 is like the epitome of what's wrong with trying to address climate change. Coming together once a year and trying to think that you're actually going to make a big change. I know there's a lot of pre-meetings that occur and a lot of people revving up for it. It is a focal point, and therefore it's useful. And I've seen a flurry of activity here of businesses desperate to have a press release ready to say, we're doing something ready for COP28. But I'm also pretty certain that once COP28 is finished, that those businesses will go back to what they were doing before. I'm really hoping that's not the case. I'm hoping I'm wrong. And the other point I wanted to make, to come back to your point, what I've seen living and working and bringing a family up here is that, in common with most places in the world, if you're actually going to be successful, you've got to invest time and effort into your home location. I meet so many people who say, Karl, I've got this great invention and I'm arriving on Thursday in Dubai. Do you think we can sign some deals on Friday and then I'm flying home at the weekend? Looking at them going, well, there's not a cat's chance in hell of that working. You need to be here for probably 6 months to even begin to understand the complexity of the way things work here. We can, exactly as you said, we've got great access. We can put you in front of a minister tomorrow. But if you're going to tell him you're going to jump on a plane the next day and fly home again, then he's not going to be that interested. What we want is commitment. We want people that are really invested in making this society work and understanding the challenges we've got, not least of which the fact that the country is only, 52 years old, and we're still learning a lot of things. We're accelerating into the distance in some of our ambition, but yet some of the fundamentals we're still working on. It's not a bad thing, it's an inevitable thing, but it requires people of passion and people of commitment to actually make that happen. So don't turn up here and think you're going to sign a deal and then buzz off home. That's just never going to work.
I love that. That's a message I think a lot of business owners and a lot of investors have been talking to people about, from that same thought process and that same fundamental approach to the region, because it is annoying that people come here and just base jump off here back home thinking that, you know, it's just very simple to do business and people would accept that without understanding the local culture or the local problems that need to be solved from even a sustainability point of view, let alone any other technology or service point of view. I was just in Sweden recently, and I was delighted to learn that one of my best friends from university, the current project he's engaged on is building not even net carbon neutral, but positive building infrastructure for low-cost housing requirements in the country. And that to do so, he needed funding to a large requirement. And he had got funding from private investors in the country that were willing to risk money to sort of try and kickstart this change. But at the same time, he's also got financing from the financial institutions who qualify him for better tax breaks because he's doing ESG-based initiatives where they're taking them through and understanding what qualifies them to do that, which I thought was wonderful to hear. But the reason I mentioned that in this conversation is because where you're talking about, you know, we hope that there are some changes that happen and there are a little more infrastructure to allow that to happen from an entrepreneur or business adoption, not just COP28 happens and everyone goes back to normal. My understanding is in the background is there are laws that are being set up and tested and discussed with financial implications for ratings of even banks. My understanding is people are from a core finance perspective are being told if you do not comply with certain initiatives, you will not get the same benefits you've been taking for granted as a financial institution, which will have a knock-on effect to their business. So I think there's subtle ways in the background for even major players to be sort of nudged into action, whether they want.
I completely agree. I mean, when I moved here, I just finished up 3 years of working with DHL on their climate change program. And we were running monthly carbon assessments on 13,500 locations. And we built their success and failure into a series of KPIs. And it was all run with software and it was all sitting on the cloud and we were able to monitor exactly what was going on. And we were able to help the people that were struggling, and we were able to reward the people that were doing well. And I remember 10 years ago, sitting with one of the government economy departments and saying, here is my software applied to the trade license principle in the UAE. So every year here, you have to have your trade license renewed. And I came up with an A to G grading system for the companies so that we could do a grade of how sustainable was that business. And I offered to provide the software for free, and that the government could log into this and say to everybody, okay, when you renew your trade license, you have to answer these 50 questions. And each year we want to see that you're getting greener, and that the scoring system in the background would be fair and objective, and that it will come up with a grading system. And if you are an A grade company, you could choose to deal with other A grade companies. And if you were a G grade company, nobody would want to deal with you anymore. And I put all that in front of the government guys, and they really didn't understand it. When you come to say that there are laws being discussed, I now hear they're thinking of legislating exactly what I proposed 10 years ago.
Oh, wow.
Of actually making it mandatory each year that each company, in order to get its trade license renewed, would have to submit a carbon footprint assessment. And in phase 2, that carbon footprint assessment would have to get better each year. And there are many of those type of things which, without the inconvenience of some of the legislation systems in other countries, we can make happen here very quickly, provided we discuss it correctly. And there's a lot behind closed doors discussions here. That's how many changes happen, as you know. They get a bunch of smart people in the room and say, okay, here's the challenge, what's the solution? We bat it around a bit, we think about upside downside risk, and then, literally the fastest one I've seen was 10 weeks. 10 weeks later, a decree comes out at sunset, and that's a new law. And that's the way we're going to get this done. And that's why the UAE stands a far better chance of actually addressing its carbon footprint than many other places. We're now into, I don't know, in the UK, we're now into our 25th or 30th year arguing whether we're going to build a train line. And across the desert behind me, in the last 5 years, we've built a train line. And I'm absolutely delighted to tell you that as of last week, I'm now providing biofuel to that train.
No way.
Yes, and I'm delighted. I've now got school buses, I've now got trucks, I've now got ships, and I've now got trains running on my fuel.
But it's all biodiesel, right?
It's all variations of biodiesel, yes. The ships run on a slightly different concoction because their engines are slightly different, but it's all pretty much the same thing. We're working on some new exciting things that I can't tell you about, but all using very low carbon biogenic sources to create fuels that you can run in existing infrastructure, existing vehicles without any modifications. So the barrier to adoption is zero.
But just shifting to one side on a very clear topic, we've talked about fuels, we've talked about legislation, we've talked about COP, we've talked about a number of things where, the elements to move in the right direction. There is one topic I know that's especially close to your heart, Karl, and I might be opening up a can of worms here, but I'm going to push the button on this, and I'm going to say it: recycling. How do you think, I know your stance on recycling, okay, but before you take off on that front, I know you've got a lot to say. Do you think, with whatever you're going to tell us now on recycling in the region, do you think COP28 is going to change it afterwards? So if you can tell us what's happening with recycling today, do you think COP28 is going to change what's happening with recycling?
I mean, one of the things that's being discussed at COP is in fact, we managed to get it onto the statute books here about 2 years ago, that certainly we got paper and waste steel, scrap steel, we got them to put in place a ban on exporting them. And
who's we, Karl? Sorry.
Various well-meaning people who like to do things behind the scenes without getting applauded for it.
So you're not even a consortium, you're not even a group, you're not a formal body, you're just a bunch of people who really care about the planet.
Just a bunch of people who have very senior levels of access and like talking to people who really want to make a change and discussing difficult problems and saying to them, okay, here's a suggestion of how we can make this work. Because in order to have a successful recycling industry, you've got to be able to provide an economic reason why somebody needs to invest 20, 40, 50, $100 million on building a recycling plant in your country. And if all of the waste is being exported, or if it's being buried in the desert at no charge, then there's pretty much no incentive for anybody to build you a recycling industry.
Right.
And this is what we did, was those of us that have put our own money up on the logic of literally build a church and they will come. We built these businesses ready for the government to then pass legislation to mandate that everything has to be locally recycled. We got together and we went and said we could do with a little bit more encouragement, please. As it turns out, the UAE signed the Basel Convention on Waste in 1992, I think, and that convention has been updated recently to categorize all hazardous waste as waste and all waste as hazardous waste. So everything that you would want to recycle here now should be processed locally if it's possible to process it locally. And the Basel Convention says if it's possible to process it locally, the government should pass legislation to ban or overtax the export of that material. So at the moment, there's discussions going on about banning the export of plastic, aluminium. We've already got paper and steel. We want a glass as well added to that list. And in my list, I want animal fats and used cooking oil. Today, I've been very successful with the business, but still 88% of the raw materials for my business are exported to Europe, where they're used in exactly the same way in Europe to reduce Europe's carbon footprint. Oh. And my explanation to anybody here is, excuse me, but why are we helping the Europeans reduce their carbon footprint and they're poking sticks at us, telling us that we're not doing enough to reduce our own carbon footprint? Essentially, the argument is that waste isn't waste. Waste is actually the raw materials for the recycling industry. And we need to stop treating waste as a problem that needs to go away at 2 o'clock in the morning and don't tell me about it. It needs to be treated as a properly inventoried, properly traced and tagged raw material, a resource of our country. And that's exactly how people are seeing it. And it's definitely this, in fact, the last 2 years, it's become very well understood now. And there's 4 government ministries working on a common strategy on how to deal with it. And I meet with them regularly and they're making good progress. And I do think we're going to get some legislation.
That's unbelievable. That's great to hear, because I know it's been a while since you and I last spoke about this topic. So it seems like it's moving in the right direction with the right people involved.
It is. I mean, it does come back to my central tenet of, I think, 16 years ago when I first got involved in doing this, which is that trying to persuade the general public to do anything is pretty much a waste of time. In that by the time the general public actually changes the way they behave, we will have shot through 2050. We will have hit not just 1.5 degrees warming, we'll be way the other side of 4.5. So we can't let the general public be the driving force of change. We have to get businesses to make business decisions and essentially to give end consumers only 3 options. You can have the green option, you can have the greener option, or you can have the net zero option. Which one do you want? Telling the consumer that you need to choose between a very high carbon footprint product and a very low carbon footprint product, and we can't explain it to you how you can make that decision, and it's really complicated, and you need a science degree to understand it. That's just not going to happen. And I've been in with the kids right from the youngest bunch I've been in to see of 5 years old, right the way up to students, graduates, trying to explain to them how much change we need to have. And even the brightest of them can't, or indeed doesn't want to get their heads around it. Whereas businesses do get this. If we can explain to them that it's in their interests, that they will make more profit and their businesses will be better afterwards if they do adopt low carbon strategies, then why wouldn't they do it? In fact, the only reason they wouldn't do it is if they're fixated on Friday afternoon and how many rounds of golf they're going to play. Essentially, the boards need to get younger, they need to get more agile, and they need to get more courageous. And we are constantly showing them that you can do that. We're now 12 years into our partnership with Neutral Fuels and McDonald's. McDonald's for 12 years has run their entire fleet without fossil fuel. So all the deliveries to the restaurants have reduced the carbon footprint down to zero. And the customers haven't had to do anything. They still walk in, they go Big Mac and fries, and they still get exactly the same product. It's just at a far lower carbon footprint because the courageous management at McDonald's decided to back me when I said to them, we can do this.
Well, it's hopefully going to have a positive effect that spreads on, because as I happen to know that business and some of the elements there from the management side, like you talked about, I do know that they have active operations in other geographies as well. So it's going to be very interesting to see how they standardize this policy in other geographies. And I'm sure they've engaged you on those conversations as well.
Our agreement with McDonald's is for 37 countries. It's
wow.
A corporate level arrangement. And the challenge is how fast we can move in those geographies, because they have other priorities, and it requires a certain level of faith and some bold decisions. But it's not just McDonald's. You know, we've been working with Del Monte, we've been working with Nestle, we've been working with other big companies that have all got to that sort of crux point of, okay, let's just put our hands up. Reducing our carbon footprint is hard. Let's not try and kid people, try and greenwash our customers into believing that we've got the answer, that there's a silver bullet. No, let's just put our hands up and go, this is going to be really hard. And we want to do it. And we don't have a choice of doing it. So it's hard, we want to do it, and we don't have a choice. So here's our plan, here's our strategy. This is what we're going to do. Some of the things we're going to do are not going to be very popular, but we're going to have to do them because we need it in order for our planet.
I think the last question I want to ask from my side is geared towards our audience. It's very international, all entrepreneurs, different age groups. I think looking at the UAE from the outside in, you're in a place that has a lot of sun. Where's all the solar paneling, right? Is it happening? Are we hearing about it? Is it just not talked about enough? I mean, solar paneling seems to be a very obvious conversation, or I'm sure a lot of people would ask. Can you shed some light on that? What is happening with solar panels?
I've now got it down to 2.5 hours. If anybody lands at Dubai Airport and has a connecting flight in more than 2.5 hours, I can kidnap them from the airport and get them to stand in the middle of our huge solar fields, and then they get it. And then I can get them back to the airport and get the connecting flight. I've got it down to 2.5 hours now. But that trip makes them realize what the dickens is going on. We've got one of the largest concentrated solar thermal systems that's up and running just off the Al Ain Road. We've got a huge solar panel plant up in the Mohammed bin Rashid solar park. They are rolling out solar here in a rate that I just cannot believe. We're going to be up to 30% of our grid mix coming from solar within the next year or two. Yeah,
30%?
It's astounding. You just got to go and see these things. It's huge. And we've got the lowest price grid mix electricity coming off them. The last project that was done at 1.2 cents a kilowatt hour. Now, most coal is sitting at about 8 or 9 cents a kilowatt hour. So we can do solar electricity here cheaper than any other form of electricity. And we've got a great grid that we can plug it into. And as you say, we've got lots and lots of sunlight. And the reason you don't know this is because, well, if you're going to put loads of solar panels, let's not put them in the middle of downtown Dubai. Let's put them in the middle of the desert. We've got huge amounts of desert. And that's exactly where they are. About half an hour's drive from my house.
But break it down a little bit further, Karl. This is all happening. Who's paying for it? Who's driving it? How is this actually coming to be?
They're being done on finance projects. So they're treating them a little bit like you would treat an oil and gas project. So you have a technology assessment phase. You then have a feed phase where the engineers come in and they design a solution. You then have an O&M contract. And ultimately the offtake is DEWA or SEWA or ADIWA, one of the state-owned electricity companies. But they will sign a 20 or 25-year offtake agreement. And then people can come in and fund or construct or operate these things depending on what part of the ecosystem they want to be in. And these are happening, been happening for the last 10 years. Wow. I think the reason I know about this, the main reason I know about it is not from a sustainability perspective. It's because I ride a Harley Davidson. And the safest place to ride a Harley is out in the desert. We've got some fantastic roads. And as you're riding out in the middle of nowhere on a Sunday morning or over the weekend, you often run into these big solar projects. And that's why I know about them. That's where I first saw the first big one.
Wow. Karl, from my side, I could go on and ask you a ton more, but we're running short of time and I'm going to pass it back to Ronit. So Ronit, back to you, and thanks so much, Karl.
Thank you so much, Karl, for joining us today, talking about sustainability, solar panels in the desert, Harley Davidsons, and eco-rock. Let's rock on to the next episode.
Thanks a lot, Karl.
You're very welcome, chaps. Thank you.